There's something about a medieval forest, the way the light filters through ancient branches, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the sense that every shadow could hide a secret. These were the places where storytellers of old spun tales that blurred the line between reality and magic, where ordinary woods became realms of wonder and danger. Even today, the enchanted forests of medieval Europe haven't lost their grip on our imaginations. They live on in the books we read, the games we play, the films that transport us, because these myths weren't just stories. They were reflections of the fears, hopes, and dreams of an entire era, and their echoes still resonate in the fantasy worlds we love. Think about the last time you got lost in a great fantasy novel or movie. Chances are, somewhere in that story, there was a forest, a place of mystery, where heroes faced trials, where witches brewed potions, where fate itself seemed to hang in the balance. That's no accident. These settings draw from a deep well of medieval myths, where forests were more than just trees. They were thresholds between worlds, places where the rules of reality bent and twisted. The Black Forest wasn't just a stretch of woodland to medieval Europeans, it was a domain of spirits and omens. The Arthurian glades weren't merely scenic backdrops, but stages for encounters with the supernatural. These legends were so vivid, so richly imagined, that they never truly faded. Instead, they evolved, weaving themselves into the fabric of modern fantasy. So what made these myths endure? Why do they still feel so alive, even centuries later? It's because they tap into something universal, the thrill of the unknown, the allure of a world just beyond our understanding. In this video, we're stepping into that world. We'll uncover 25 of the most captivating enchanted forest myths from medieval Europe, tracing their origins, their hidden meanings, and the ways they've shaped the stories we tell today. From the eerie whispers of the Broceliande to the trickster spirits of Germanic folklore, each tale is a thread in a grand tapestry of imagination. So if you've ever wondered where your favorite fantasy tropes really began, or if you just love a good story steeped in mystery, you're in the right place. The path ahead is lined with ancient trees and older magic. Let's walk it together. To understand why medieval forests became such powerful symbols of enchantment, we have to step back into a world without streetlights or maps, a world where the wilderness was vast, unexplored, and deeply mysterious. For people living in medieval Europe, forests weren't just clusters of trees, they were frontiers. Beyond the safety of village fences, the woods stretched into darkness, home to wolves, bandits, and things far stranger. It's no wonder these spaces became fertile ground for myth, but the roots of these legends run even deeper, tangled with the spiritual beliefs of pre-Christian Europe. Ancient Celtic and Germanic tribes saw forests as sacred groves where druids performed rituals, where gods whispered through the leaves. When Christianity spread, these old beliefs didn't vanish. Instead, they transformed. The spirits of the trees became saints or demons, holy wells replaced pagan springs, and the forest's magic lingered, now wrapped in new symbolism. Take the legend of the Green Knight, for example, a towering, otherworldly figure who emerges from the wilderness to challenge King Arthur's court. He isn't just a villain, he's the forest itself, testing the pride of civilization. Or consider the countless tales of fairy realms hidden just beyond a moss-covered oak. These stories weren't escapism. They were ways to make sense of a world where nature was both provider and threat. A fallen log might hide a hobgoblin. A clearing at dusk could be a gateway to the otherworld. Even the language of the time reflects this duality. The Old English word voodoo didn't just mean forest, it carried echoes of chaos, raw material, and untamed potential. What's fascinating is how these myths adapted to their changing world. As medieval society grew more structured, the forest became a place of rebellion and renewal. Outlaws like Robin Hood hid in Sherwood, turning the wild into a refuge from injustice. Saints like Saint Giles found solitude among ancient oaks, proving holiness could thrive beyond church walls. The forest was where rules bent, where identity could be remade, and that's exactly why it still captivates us. Modern fantasy didn't invent the idea of a transformative woodland. It inherited centuries of layered meaning. When you walk through Lothlorien in The Lord of the Rings or the haunted woods of The Witcher, you're walking paths first carved by medieval storytellers who knew that the deepest magic always grows where light and shadow meet. The night sky splits open with the sound of baying hounds, hoofbeats like thunder, and a chorus of unearthly cries. This is the Wild Hunt, one of the most haunting myths to emerge from medieval Europe's shadowed forests. In Germanic and Norse lore, it was said that certain nights, especially during the howling winds of winter, would herald the arrival of this spectral cavalcade. Led by figures like Odin, cloaked in his wide-brimmed hat, or sometimes even the restless spirit of King Arthur himself, the hunt was a force of raw, untamed power. To see it was an omen, a warning that death or disaster loomed. Some tales claimed those foolish enough to mock the riders or step into their path would be dragged into the afterlife, forever bound to the ghostly procession. What makes the Wild Hunt so fascinating is how it embodies the medieval mind's deepest fears, the terror of forces beyond human control. Storms, famine, plague, these were the horsemen of their world, and the hunt became their mythic echo. But it wasn't just about fear. The legend also spoke to a strange reverence for the wild, untamed aspects of nature. Odin, as the leader, wasn't just a harbinger of doom. He was a god of wisdom and poetry, a reminder that chaos and creativity were intertwined. The hunt blurred the line between destroyer and deity, leaving witnesses awestruck as much as terrified. You can still feel its influence today. In The Witcher, the Wild Hunt isn't just a ghost story. It's an army of otherworldly warriors, relentless and inevitable. Video games like World of Warcraft and Dragon Age borrow its imagery, turning it into a symbol of unstoppable fate. Even modern fantasy literature keeps the hunt alive, reimagining it as everything from a metaphor for war to a literal chase between worlds. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is the way it captures something primal, the idea that nature isn't just something we live in, but something that watches, hunts, and remembers. The Wild Hunt wasn't just a story, it was a mirror held up to humanity's smallness in the face of the unknown. And in that, it remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Deep in the heart of Arthurian legend lies a forest that doesn't just test a knight's sword arm, it tests his soul. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight isn't just a tale of clashing blades, it's a story where the wilderness itself becomes a moral compass. When that colossal, emerald-skinned stranger rides into Camelot on New Year's Day, swinging an axe and issuing a deadly challenge, he brings more than just a game. He brings the raw, untamed spirit of the forest into the polished halls of King Arthur's court, and with it, a lesson about the fragility of human virtue. What makes the Green Knight so unforgettable isn't just his otherworldly appearance, it's what he represents. He's not a villain, not quite a monster, but something far more unsettling, a force of nature wrapped in humanoid form. When Gawain chops off his head, only for the knight to pick it up and laugh, the message is clear: civilization's rules don't apply here. The forest where Gawain later journeys to fulfill his bargain isn't just a setting, it's a character. Its twisting paths, biting winter winds, and eerie encounters like the seductive Lady Bertilac are all part of the test. Every step closer to the Green Chapel forces Gawain to confront his own fears, his pride, and the uncomfortable truth that even the noblest knight can falter. This myth's brilliance lies in its layers. On one level, it's a thrilling adventure, a beheading game with supernatural stakes, but peel it back, and you'll find a meditation on the tension between human order and nature's chaos. Camelot stands for ideals, chivalry, honor, control. The forest, though, it's where those ideals get muddy. The Green Knight doesn't just want Gawain's bravery, he wants his honesty. When Gawain flinches at the axe's final swing and later hides a magical girdle out of fear, he doesn't fail, he becomes human. That's why this story still resonates. Modern fantasy is full of enchanted forests that reveal a hero's true self. Think of Frodo's moral struggles in Lothlorien or Geralt's impossible choices in the Brokilon. These aren't just homages to Arthurian lore, they're proof that the Green Knight's lesson endures. The wild places don't judge us by our titles or oaths, but by the choices we make when no one's watching. And let's not overlook the Green Knight's aesthetic legacy. That towering, plant-clad figure has inspired everything from Tolkien's Ents to Marvel's Groot. But more than his look, it's his role as the forest's voice that sticks with us. He's not a mindless monster to be slain, he's a mirror, forcing heroes and audiences to ask, what would you risk for honor? What would you hide to survive? In a world where fantasy forests so often serve as mere backdrops, the Green Knight reminds us that the oldest trees have the sharpest eyes and the deepest lessons. Step into a Celtic forest at twilight, where the mist hangs low between ancient oaks and the air hums with something just beyond hearing. This is where the veil between worlds grows thin. In the folklore of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, forests weren't merely landscapes. They were liminal spaces, doorways to the otherworld. Picture a ring of mushrooms sprouting overnight in a clearing, or a sudden gust of wind rustling leaves with no source. These were signs you'd entered a fairy glade, a place where time bent to its own rules. A mortal might dance with the owl's she for what felt like hours, only to return home and find decades had passed. These stories weren't just whimsy, they were warnings. To cut down a fairy tree, to mock the unseen, or to accept food from the fair folk was to invite curses, vanishing acts, or worse. The Celts saw nature as alive with intention. Every stream, grove, and hill had its spirit. The hawthorn tree, often found alone in fields, was especially sacred. To harm one risked angering the fairies who dwelled within. Even today in parts of Ireland, you'll see farmers leave these trees untouched, their branches tied with ribbons as silent apologies to the unseen. This deep respect for nature's hidden residents shaped some of fantasy's most iconic settings. Lothlorien in The Lord of the Rings, with its golden leaves and ageless elves, mirrors the Celtic otherworld's timeless beauty. The Witch's Brokilon Forest, where dryads guard their domain with lethal precision, echoes the old tales of fairy kingdoms that tolerated no trespassers. What makes these myths endure isn't just their eerie charm, it's their wisdom. They remind us that nature isn't passive, that some places hold older claims than human ownership. When modern stories show characters bargaining with forest spirits or facing consequences for ecological harm, they're channeling a tradition that's millennia old. The Celts didn't romanticize the wilderness. They understood its duality, its capacity for wonder and wrath. That's why their fairy glades still feel so potent in our stories today. They're not just settings, they're living lessons wrapped in moss and moonlight, whispering that the world is stranger and more alive than we might dare to believe. In the shadowed woods of medieval France, where the wind carried whispers of unseen watchers, another kind of monster prowled, one neither fully beast nor man, but something caught between. Werewolf legends weren't just campfire tales here. They were visceral fears carved into the collective psyche. Take the beast of Gawain, a creature whose real-life attacks in the 1700s left over 100 dead. Its savagery so extreme that peasants swore it was no ordinary wolf. But long before those bloody events, the forests of France already teemed with stories of shapeshifters, cursed nobles, penitent sinners, and even knights who traded their humanity for power. These weren't mindless monsters, they were tragic figures, their stories asking a chilling question. What happens when the wildness we try to bury inside us claws its way out? The medieval werewolf myth thrived on paradox. The forest, often a place of sanctuary for outcasts, became a prison for these half-transformed souls. In tales like By Sklavret, a nobleman confesses to his wife that he spends days as a wolf, hiding his clothes in a hollow tree to regain his human form. When she steals them, she traps him in his beastly state, a betrayal that twists the forest from refuge to cage. This duality echoes through modern werewolf lore. Think of Remus Lupin in Harry Potter, whose monthly transformations are both a burden and a source of strength, or the tortured Jacob Black in Twilight, whose loyalty wars with his animal instincts. These characters inherit their complexity from medieval roots, where the line between monster and victim was always blurred. What made these French legends so enduring wasn't just the horror, it was the haunting humanity at their core. A knight cursed for his arrogance, a mother whose grief twisted her into a she-wolf, a peasant whose hunger turned him feral. These stories held up a dark mirror to society's own fears of chaos. The forest amplified those fears. By day, it might offer herbs to heal or game to hunt. By night, it became a stage for primal transformation. Even the church wrestled with these tales, sometimes framing lycanthropy as divine punishment, other times as demonic trickery. The werewolf was the ultimate outsider, neither fully damned nor redeemed, and that ambiguity is why we still can't look away. Today's fantasy landscapes are littered with their descendants. From the brooding werewolves of The Witcher to the pack dynamics of Teen Wolf, each iteration carries traces of those medieval forests. The idea that monstrosity isn't just about teeth and claws, but about the parts of ourselves we can't control. The next time you see a full moon in a story, remember, its light doesn't just transform bodies, it exposes the wild, unspoken truths we hide beneath our skin. And the forest, it's always waiting to welcome or condemn those who can no longer outrun them. Sherwood Forest wasn't just a backdrop for Robin Hood's adventures, it was a character in its own right, breathing with its own magic. Among its towering oaks, one tree stood above the rest, the Enchanted Oak, a gnarled giant said to shelter ancient spirits. Folklore claimed its roots ran so deep they touched the underworld, and its branches hummed with secrets whispered by the wind. When Robin and his band of outlaws took refuge beneath its boughs, they weren't just hiding from the sheriff's men. They were under the protection of something older, something wilder. Arrows loosed near the tree flew with uncanny precision, as if guided by unseen hands. Even the forest itself seemed to conspire against tyranny, its thickets thickening to thwart pursuers, its path shifting to lead allies to safety. This wasn't just superstition, it was rebellion woven into myth. In a time when forests were shrinking under the axes of nobles hungry for land, Sherwood became a symbol of resistance. The Enchanted Oak embodied the idea that nature itself could take sides, sheltering the oppressed and punishing the cruel. Medieval peasants, stripped of power, found solace in tales where the very trees defied their oppressors. The forest wasn't passive, it was an ally, its magic a great equalizer against the iron fist of authority. You can see this legacy alive in modern fantasy. The whomping willow in Harry Potter isn't just a violent tree, it guards a secret passage protecting the vulnerable. The sentient forests of Avatar or Princess Mononoke don't merely exist, they fight back against those who would harm them. Even video games like The Elder Scrolls feature sacred groves where nature intervenes on behalf of the righteous. These stories all trace their roots to Sherwood's mythic oaks, where justice wasn't just a human ideal but a force woven into the land itself. What makes the Enchanted Oak myth so enduring is its emotional truth. It's not just about magic, it's about the hope that the world might bend toward fairness, that even the silent giants of the forest would stand with the downtrodden. Robin Hood's legends remind us that forests were never just timber to medieval people. They were sanctuaries, co-conspirators, and living proof that no king's decree could tame the wild heart of the land. And when we see a hero in modern fantasy raise a sword beneath the boughs of an ancient tree, we're witnessing the echo of a 1,000-year-old belief that sometimes the best allies aren't knights or wizards, but the oldest things in the woods, and they've been choosing sides for far longer than we've been keeping score. Deep in the heart of Germany's Black Forest, where the pines grow so thick they blot out the sun, medieval whispers spoke of gatherings no mortal was meant to witness. When the moon swelled to its fullest, legend said the trees would part to reveal hidden clearings, and there, beneath the silver light, witches danced. This wasn't just superstition, it was a fear that crackled through entire villages, one that would ignite some of history's darkest chapters. The idea of the witches' Sabbath took root here, painting the forest not just as a place of shadows, but as a theater of the profane, where women flew on broomsticks forged from cursed wood, where demons presided over feasts of forbidden knowledge, where the very air pulsed with spells meant to blight crops and steal souls. What made these tales so potent wasn't just their horror, it was their specificity. Trial records from the witch hunts describe eerie details, ointments made from mandrake roots, midnight pacts signed in goat's blood, the way the earth itself seemed to tremble as covens summoned storms. The Black Forest became more than a location. It was a character in its own right. Its dense thickets and mist-laden hollows the perfect backdrop for the unimaginable. And while most accusations were fabrications born from paranoia, misogyny, or sheer desperation, the stories clung like brambles. Even now, walking those woods at dusk, it's hard not to feel the weight of that history, the sense that some clearings might still remember the whirl of dark revelry. Modern horror owes a debt to these myths. Washington Irving's Sleepy Hollow transplants the Sabbath's dread to the Hudson Valley, its headless horseman a spectral echo of the demonic huntsman said to lead witch processions. The Blair Witch Project trades broomsticks for handheld cameras but keeps the forest's role unchanged, a place where logic unravels and the old stories might just be true. Even fantasy games like The Witcher 3 and Dragon Age feature their own twisted Sabbaths where magic isn't sparkly or safe, but raw and unsettling. These aren't just tropes, they're cultural memories, reminders of a time when the boundary between folklore and fear was paper thin. Yet there's another layer to these legends one often overlooked. For all their terror, the witches of the Black Forest were also symbols of resistance. In a world where women had little power, the idea that they might sneak away to commune with forces beyond male control was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Some historians suggest these myths preserved fragments of pre-Christian rites, suppressed traditions that survived in secret beneath the boughs. The forest, then, wasn't just a den of evil. It was a sanctuary for the marginalized, a place where the disenfranchised could in story, if not in fact reclaim agency. That duality lingers today. When we see a coven in modern media, they're rarely just monsters. They're outcasts, rebels, or anti-heroes. Their magic a metaphor for everything society tries and fails to suppress. The Black Forest's legacy isn't just about broomsticks and cauldrons. It's about the power of place, how a landscape can shape stories, and how those stories, in turn, shape our deepest fears. The next time you watch a horror film where the trees seem to whisper, or play a game where the woods hide more than wolves, remember, those chills have roots. They stretch back to a time when people truly believed the dark could dance, and that the forest remembered every step. Imagine wandering through a Slavic forest at dusk, where the wind doesn't just rustle the leaves, it carries melodies. Ancient oaks hum low, mournful tunes, birch trees chime like silver bells, and somewhere in the distance, a chorus of pines seems to whisper secrets in harmony. This wasn't just fantasy to medieval Slavs, it was a living truth. Their folklore brimmed with tales of sentient trees, not as passive scenery, but as beings with voices, emotions, and even the ability to uproot themselves and walk. A traveler who showed respect might hear their songs as a blessing, but those who harmed the forest, they'd soon find themselves lost in a labyrinth of shifting trunks, the trees themselves closing ranks like silent sentinels. At the heart of these myths stood the Leshy, the forest's enigmatic guardian. More than just a spirit, he was the embodiment of the wilderness, a shapeshifter who could tower as high as the oldest pine or shrink to hide among the ferns. With moss tangled in his hair and eyes that glowed like fireflies, the Leshy wasn't inherently cruel. He'd guide lost children home or lead hunters to game if they left offerings of bread or honey. But cross him and his tricks turned sinister. Paths would vanish overnight, compasses spun wildly. Some claimed he'd mimic the voices of loved ones to lure the arrogant deeper into the woods where they'd vanish for years or return forever changed. What made these stories so enduring was their moral spine. Slavic folklore didn't just paint the forest as magical, it framed it as a sacred covenant. To take a tree's life without prayer, to waste what the forest provided, was to invite the Leshy's wrath. This wasn't mere superstition, it was ecology wrapped in myth. Communities relied on the woods for survival, and these tales taught balance. Take only what you need, honor what you take, and never forget you're a guest in a realm older than kings. You'll find the Leshy's fingerprints all over modern fantasy. The Broccolan forest in The Witcher isn't just home to dryads, it's a character that breathes, reacts, and defends itself, much like the sentient groves of Slavic lore. In The Lord of the Rings, Old Man Willow's malevolent grip on Frodo mirrors the Slavic belief that trees could hold grudges. Even Harry Potter's Whomping Willow channels that old fear, the idea that nature might fight back. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in how these myths reframed humanity's role. The Leshy wasn't a villain to slay, he was a reminder. The forest wasn't a resource to exploit, it was a living network, pulsing with rhythms and rules of its own. And that's why these tales still resonate. In an age of climate crisis, the idea of trees as sentient beings no longer feels like fantasy, it feels prophetic. Scientists now speak of the wood wide web, the way forests communicate through fungal networks, warning each other of danger. The medieval Slavs might have called it magic. Either way, their myths hold a mirror to our modern dilemmas. What happens when we stop listening to the songs of the trees? How long before the forest decides we're no longer welcome? The Leshy's laughter might just be the wind, or it might be the oldest lesson of all, rustling through the leaves. The wild was never ours to conquer. It was always waiting for us to remember our place. High above Midgard's mortal realm, bathed in the golden glow of perpetual twilight, lay Alfheim, a forest where the very air shimmered with enchantment. In Norse mythology, this wasn't just the home of elves, It was a living masterpiece, a place where trees bore leaves like stained glass and rivers sang with the voices of unseen spirits. The elves, or Alpha, weren't the tiny, mischievous sprites of later folklore. They were radiant beings taller than men, their grace matched only by their skill. To the Vikings, they were demigods of craft and light, weaving magic into every blade of grass and every note of their otherworldly music. Time in Alfheim didn't march forward, it spiraled, danced, leaving visitors breathless as days blurred into moments or stretched into eternities. What set these elven forests apart was their duality. They weren't just beautiful, they were alive with intention. A single touch from an elf could heal a mortal's wounds or curse them with endless longing. The trees themselves bore fruit that granted inspiration or madness, depending on the eater's heart. This wasn't a realm of simple whimsy. It was a reflection of nature's sublime power, where every leaf and shadow held purpose. When the Norse spoke of Alfheim, they weren't describing a fantasy escape. They were acknowledging a truth their worldview embraced, that beauty and danger often shared the same root. Tolkien didn't just borrow from this myth, he deepened it. Rivendell's timeless halls, where weary travelers find respite under arched boughs, are Alfheim reimagined. The elves of Middle-earth, with their melancholy wisdom and preternatural artistry, carry the same essence as their Norse predecessors, but the influence stretches further. The Witcher's Enchanted elves, with their fading glory and bitter pride, echo the Alpha's tragic edge. Even Dungeons and Dragons' Feywild, a realm of endless twilight and capricious magic, owes its DNA to those shimmering Scandinavian glades. Yet the most fascinating legacy of Alfheim isn't in its aesthetics, it's in its philosophy. Norse elves weren't just magical, they were makers. Their forests thrived because they shaped them with intention, blending art and nature until the two became inseparable. That idea resonates today, from the bioluminescent jungles of Avatar to the living architecture of the legend of Zelda's Kokiri Forest. These modern realms remind us that the oldest myths weren't about escaping reality, but about reimagining our relationship with it. The elves didn't hide from the world, they sang it into something greater, and when we walk through a sunlit grove, feeling that inexplicable tug of wonder, we're brushing against the edges of their ancient magic, still alive, still waiting for those willing to listen. The forests of the Brothers Grimm don't whisper, they howl with warnings. Think of the towering trees in Hansel and Gretel, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, or the oppressive thickets of Little Red Riding Hood, where every rustle might hide a wolf's grin. These weren't just settings, they were trials by wilderness, places where children faced the world's sharpest edges and emerged, if they were lucky, forever changed. The Grimms didn't invent these tropes, but they sharpened them into blades, turning folk tales into moral crucibles where the forest was both villain and teacher. Consider the duality in Snow White. The woods are first a death sentence. The queen orders the princess's murder there, trusting the wild to erase her beauty. But then the same forest becomes her sanctuary, leading her to the dwarf's cottage. This wasn't random. The Grimm's forests mirrored the unpredictability of life itself, cruel one moment, merciful the next, always demanding resilience. Even the witch's candy house in Hansel and Gretel plays this game. It's a trap, yes, but also a test. The children don't just escape, they outsmart the darkness, burning the witch in her own oven. The message was clear. Survival in these woods wasn't about strength alone. It was about wit, courage, and sometimes the willingness to fight fire with fire. Modern fantasy owes these tales an unpayable debt. Without the Grimm's morally grey woods, would we have the haunted forests of Pan's Labyrinth, where innocence and horror twine like ivy? Would Game of Thrones have dared to make its Wolfswood a place of both refuge and reckoning. The Grimms proved that fairy tales could be more than escapism. They could be mirrors showing us the jagged paths to growth. Even Disney, for all its sugar coating, couldn't fully sanitize this legacy. The menacing trees of Snow White and the perilous thickets of Sleeping Beauty still carry echoes of those darker roots. Yet there's another layer here, one often overlooked. The Grimm's forests weren't just about fear, they were about agency. In a world where children had little power, these stories gave them a blueprint. Trust your instincts, question strangers, and when the world tries to devour you, fight back. That's why these myths still grip us. They don't promise happy endings, they promise transformation. The next time you walk through a forest in a game or book, feeling that old, familiar dread mixed with wonder, remember, you're stepping into a tradition as old as the Grimm's ink, where every shadow holds a lesson and every path, no matter how twisted, leads somewhere worth surviving for. There's something unsettling about the moment a hunt turns uncanny, when the stag you've chased for hours through the bracken stops, turns its head, and you realize its eyes glow with an otherworldly light. Across medieval England, whispers spoke of these phantom stags, creatures that seemed to step right out of the mist, antlers gleaming like frost in moonlight. They'd appear at the forest's edge, bold as you please, daring hunters to follow only to vanish the moment an arrow was loosed, leaving pursuers stranded in the wood's deepest, darkest hollows. Some legends claimed these apparitions were the spirits of sacred deer, guardians of the wild punishing those who hunted without respect. Others swore they were something far older, fragments of pagan myths half remembered, where the stag wasn't just prey but a guide to realms beyond mortal sight. What makes these tales so compelling is how they twist the familiar into the supernatural. A stag in daylight was just an animal, a stag that led you in circles until twilight, then dissolved into silver mist. That was the forest itself passing judgment. The symbolism here is razor sharp. The pursuit of something unattainable, glory, love, power mirrored in the futile chase through the trees. The moment the hunter becomes the hunted, stumbling upon a clearing where the air hums with unseen presences. These stories weren't just spooky campfire fodder, they were cautionary tales about the price of obsession. Push too far into the wild, they warned, and the wild might push back. Modern fantasy has embraced these phantom guides with open arms. Think of the white stag in the Chronicles of Narnia, appearing only to those destined for a greater purpose, or the spectral heart in The Witcher 3, leading Geralt to a confrontation with the otherworldly. Even Harry Potter's Patronus charm draws from this tradition, where the stag isn't just a protector, but a symbol of enduring love that transcends death. The legacy of these myths isn't just in their imagery, though, it's in their emotional core. The phantom stag isn't merely a plot device, it's a mirror. What does the hunter see when the creature finally turns to face them? Their own greed, their unspoken regrets, the path they were too blind to follow. And that's the true magic of these legends. They transform the forest into a psychological landscape where every shadow holds a lesson. The next time you encounter a ghostly creature in a game or book, whether it's a stag, a wolf, or something stranger, ask yourself, is it leading you toward danger or toward the truth you've been avoiding? The medieval woods were never just trees and dirt. They were riddles wrapped in twilight, and the phantom stag was their most haunting question. How far will you go before you realize you're the one being hunted? Dragons didn't just live in medieval forests, they owned them. Picture a clearing where the trees grow unnaturally gnarled, their trunks scarred by ancient claws, their branches twisted as if frozen in mid-flight. The air hangs thick with the stench of sulfur, and the ground trembles with every breath of the beast coiled at its heart. This wasn't just a monster's hideout, it was a throne room, a place where raw power and primal fear intertwined. From the mist-shrouded woods of Scandinavia to the deep glens of Wales, dragons claimed these wild spaces as their domains, not just as predators, but as living embodiments of nature's indifference to human ambition. What made these creatures so terrifying wasn't just their fiery breath or impenetrable scales, it was what they represented. A dragon hoarding gold in a forest wasn't merely guarding treasure, it was mocking the very idea of human ownership. In myths like Beowulf, the dragon's lair is a place where civilization's rules dissolve. When the creature awakens to find a single goblet stolen from its hoard, its wrath isn't greed. It's outrage at the audacity of humans to claim what the wild had claimed first. The forest, with its tangled depths and hidden pathways, became the perfect stage for this struggle. Unlike a castle or mountain, a woodland lair was alive, shifting, unpredictable. Every root could trip a hero, every shadow could hide a strike. But dragons weren't just mindless destroyers. Some legends, like the Welsh tale of the red dragon battling the white, painted them as symbols of sovereignty, forces of chaos, yes, but also of transformation. The forest lair wasn't just a villain's hideout, it was a crucible. To face the dragon meant to confront the untamed parts of oneself. Think of Smaug in The Hobbit, whose riddling conversation with Bilbo reveals as much about the hobbit's cleverness as the dragon's pride. Or Game of Thrones' Drogon, whose fiery independence mirrors Daenerys' own struggle between control and abandon. These modern iterations didn't invent the dragon's psychological depth, they inherited it from medieval storytellers who understood that the greatest monsters are mirrors. And let's not forget the treasure. A dragon's hoard wasn't just wealth, it was a trap. The Norse Fafnir, once a dwarf transformed by greed, coiled atop his cursed gold in a forest so dark even sunlight feared to enter. His very existence warned that the pursuit of riches could twist you into the thing you feared most. That theme echoes through fantasy today, from the cursed vaults of Harry Potter to the ruinous allure of Skyrim's dragon priests. The forest, with its deceptive beauty and hidden dangers, was the perfect metaphor for ambition's double edge. Yet for all their terror, dragons also held a strange allure. In Slavic folklore, the Zime wasn't always a villain. It could bless crops or teach secret knowledge to those brave enough to seek it. The forest then wasn't just a battleground, it was a school. To enter a dragon's domain was to gamble. Would you leave with wisdom or just another scar? That duality keeps these myths alive. When we watch a hero like Geralt of Rivia negotiate with a golden dragon in The Witcher, or see Eragon bond with Saphira in Inheritance Cycle, we're seeing the medieval forest's legacy, a place where the line between monster and mentor was always written in smoke. Long before the Middle Ages, Aesop's fables were already proving that forests weren't just settings. They were classrooms without walls. Picture a sun-dappled glade where a fox debates with a crow, or a hollow tree where a tortoise outwits a hare. These weren't just animal antics, they were sharp, timeless lessons disguised as woodland encounters. While Aesop's tales originated in ancient Greece, their influence seeped into medieval folklore like roots through soil, shaping how European storytellers saw the natural world. The forest became a place where every creature, from the lowliest mouse to the craftiest wolf, had something to teach if you knew how to listen. What made these talking beasts so enduring was their duality. A fox could be a villain stealing cheese one moment and a hero exposing hypocrisy the next. The animals weren't just stand-ins for humans, they embodied nature's contradictions, clever yet cruel, generous yet ruthless. Medieval monks copying Aesop's fables added their own twists, weaving Christian morals into the mix. The lion wasn't just a proud king of beasts, he might symbolize the temptation of power. The ant storing food for winter became a parable about piety and preparation. Even the trees seemed to lean in, their rustling leaves underscoring each tale's warning. Fast forward to today, and you'll find Aesop's legacy alive in every animated forest where animals talk. Disney's Robin Hood turns sly foxes into charming outlaws, while Zootopia reframes predator-prey dynamics as a metaphor for prejudice. Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke takes it further. Its talking wolves and boars aren't just wise, they're furious, echoing Aesop's darker lessons about human arrogance. Even video games like the Elder Scrolls give players quests from sentient animals, proving that the tradition of woodland wisdom hasn't faded, it's evolved. Yet there's a deeper layer here. Aesop's fables worked because they respected the forest's rules. The tortoise wins not by magic, but by persistence. The crow falls for flattery because that's what crows do. Modern stories that borrow this framework succeed when they honor the same truth. The best animal tales aren't just humans in fur coats. They're reminders that nature has its own logic, its own justice, and if we pause between the trees long enough, we might just hear it speaking. There were places in the ancient world where the boundary between earth and the divine grew thin, where the very air hummed with unseen power. The druids of Celtic Europe knew these spaces well, the sacred groves where no axe was allowed to fall, where the trees themselves were temples. Medieval chroniclers, both fascinated and fearful of these pagan holdouts, preserved fragments of their lore, describing groves so holy that even birds refused to sing within their bounds. To enter uninvited wasn't just trespassing, it was sacrilege, a violation of pacts older than stone circles. These weren't merely pretty clearings. Druidic groves functioned as living libraries, their patterns of oak, ash, and thorn encoding knowledge passed through generations. The Roman historian Tacitus shuddered as he described altars, stained with human blood, but modern archaeology suggests a subtler truth. Rituals here likely revolved around cycle solstices measured by shadows between sacred trunks, healing herbs gathered under specific moon phases. The forest wasn't just a backdrop, it was an active participant. Vines might twist into prophetic shapes, springs bubble with visions. To the druids, every root and rivulet was a thread in nature's grand design. Fantasy worlds have eagerly borrowed this mystique. The whomping willow in Harry Potter isn't just violent, it guards secrets, much like druidic groves shielded their rites. The Witcher's Circle of the Elements, where sorcerers draw power from primal forces, echoes the druidic belief in forest-sanctioned magic. Even Assassin's Creed Valhalla recreates these groves as quest hubs, where players solve puzzles rooted in Ogham script and lunar alignment. But the most poignant homage might be the Elden Ring's minor Erdtree's golden-barked giants pulsing with sacramental energy, their roots cradling the bones of forgotten saints. What makes the Forbidden Grove myth so enduring isn't just its aesthetic, it's the underlying philosophy. Druids didn't worship trees, they communed with the intelligence they believed resided within them. A medieval Irish text warns that cutting down a sacred oak would bring the sky down upon the earth, not as punishment, but as consequence, the unraveling of an ancient balance. Modern ecology validates this intuition. Scientists now speak of the wood wide web, the fungal networks connecting trees into cooperative systems. The druids might have called it magic. Either way, their groves remind us that some truths aren't mined from stone or written on parchment. They grow slowly and silently in the places we've forgotten to listen. And perhaps that's why these myths still haunt us. In an age of concrete and screens, the idea of a living, knowing forest taps into something primal. When fantasy games let us attune to ancient trees or books describe whispers in the leaves, we're not just escaping reality, we're remembering an older one. The druids' groves may be gone, but their lesson lingers. There are still clearings where the world speaks, if we're brave enough to step off the path. In the quiet glades of Ireland, where the mist clung to the hawthorns like ghostly fingers, parents told their children to steer clear of certain trees, not because of wolves or witches, but because of the things that might be left behind. Folklore whispered of changeling trees, their gnarled roots cradling hollows where the fair folk would place their twisted substitutes. A mother might lay her infant down for just a moment, turn her back to gather firewood, and return to find something. Different in the cradle, the child's eyes a shade too knowing, its laughter edged with a sound like wind through dead branches. The forest, usually a place of play and foraging, became a stage for every parent's deepest dread, that the wildness beyond their doorstep could steal the most precious thing they had. These stories weren't just about supernatural kidnappings, they were survival lessons wrapped in myth. In a time when infant mortality was tragically common, the changeling tale offered a way to make sense of the unthinkable. A child who faded too quickly, whose cries turned strange, might be explained as a fairy's cruel trick. The real horror wasn't the swap itself, but what it represented, the vulnerability of love in a world where nature and the unseen could snatch happiness without warning. The forest clearing, often a place of communal gatherings, took on a darker role, a threshold where the rules of humanity didn't apply. Modern fantasy has kept this fear alive, though the stakes have shifted. Neil Gaiman's Stardust gives us the market of Wall, where a stolen child grows up half-fey, torn between worlds. Pan's Labyrinth twists the trope further, blurring whether Ophelia's underworld is escape or delusion. Even the Witcher's brooding adaptations feature changelings, their stories laced with the same existential terror. What if the thing you raised wasn't yours at all? The genius of these retellings lies in their ambiguity. Unlike medieval tales where the changeling was a clear evil, modern versions ask harder questions. Is the monster truly malicious or just a lost soul caught between realms? Is the real tragedy the swap or the family's inability to love what's different? Yet the changeling myth's deepest roots tap into something older than fear, the forest as a keeper of balance. Irish folklore often described fairy abductions as tithes, payments for some unseen harmony. A human child taken might mean a fairy one given, as if the woods themselves demanded equilibrium. This idea echoes in stories like the Dark Crystal, where the natural order requires sacrifice, or the Hazelwood, where folktales enforce brutal fairness. The changeling wasn't just a thief, it was a reminder that no one, not even the most sheltered family, existed outside nature's ledger. What lingers most about these tales isn't their scares, it's their sorrow. The parents in these stories rarely get happy endings. Sometimes they expose the changeling with cruel tricks, holding it over a fire to force the fairies to return the real child, only to be left with empty arms. Other times they raise the strange creature as their own, forever wondering. That heartbreak is why the myth endures. It's not about monsters in the dark, it's about the monsters we imagine when the dark takes what we love. And the forest, with its shifting shadows and whispering leaves, remains the perfect accomplice, a place where every rustle could be the wind, a predator, or something far harder to name. The legend of the golden apples of the Hesperides might have begun in Greek mythology, but like so many ancient tales, it didn't stay put. By the Middle Ages, whispers of these mythical fruits had woven their way into European folklore, transforming deep, shadowed forests into treasure vaults guarded by more than just locks and chains. Imagine a grove where the trees bore not just fruit, but gleaming golden orbs, each one a temptation, a test, a promise of something beyond mortal reach. These weren't your everyday apples, they were the ultimate symbols of desire, dangling just out of reach like the last rays of sunset slipping through the branches. Medieval storytellers took the Hesperides' garden and planted it firmly in their own enchanted woods. Sometimes the apples granted eternal youth, other times they cursed those who plucked them without permission. But the core of the myth remained unchanged. These treasures weren't just hidden, they were protected, maybe by a dragon coiled around the trunk, its scales the same burnished gold as the fruit. Maybe by an enchantress who asked riddles with life or death stakes. The forest, already a place of mystery, became a labyrinth of moral trials. To seek the apples wasn't just an adventure, it was a confrontation with human nature itself. How much would you risk for a taste of the divine, and what would you lose in the process? You can trace this theme straight into modern fantasy. The poisoned apple in Snow White isn't just a plot device, it's a descendant of those golden temptations, a shimmering trap disguised as a gift. In The Hobbit, the dwarves' lust for Smaug's hoard mirrors the reckless hunger of those who'd storm a sacred grove. Even Harry Potter's Sorcerer's Stone, hidden deep in the Forbidden Corridor, carries the same energy, an object of infinite desire, shielded by enchantments meant to weed out the unworthy. The Golden Apple myth taught us that magic and danger grow on the same branch, and fantasy has never forgotten the lesson. But here's the twist, these stories weren't just about greed. They were about transformation. In Celtic lore, eating an otherworldly fruit could bind you to the land of the Fae forever. Norse myths told of Idun's apples, which kept the gods young until they were stolen, threatening the very order of the cosmos. The forest's treasures weren't passive prizes, they were active forces reshaping those who sought them. That's why the golden apple endures. It's not just a MacGuffin, it's a mirror. What does your hero see when they hold it? Glory, corruption, a reflection of their deepest lack, and that's the real magic of this myth. It turns the forest into a philosopher's classroom where every glimmering fruit poses the same unspoken question: is immortality worth the price of your humanity? The next time you watch a character in your favorite story reach for a cursed artifact or a shimmering elixir, remember, they're standing in a tradition as old as those medieval woods, where the sweetest fruits always grow just beyond the edge of wisdom. A flicker in the mist, a dancing glow just beyond the next bend in the path. What begins as a curious light soon becomes a siren call, leading weary travelers into the swamp's embrace. Across Europe's medieval forests, from the peat bogs of Ireland to the Black Forest's depths, legends spoke of the-wisps' phantom flames that lured the unwary to their doom. Some said they were the spirits of unbaptized children, doomed to wander. Others claimed they were mischievous fairies, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies as they led victims into quicksand or worse. But the underlying message was universal. Not all that glows in the dark is meant to guide you. What made these myths so chilling was their psychological precision. The-wisp wasn't a monster you could fight, it preyed on hope. A lost woodsman, exhausted and disoriented, would spot that faint glimmer and mistake it for a cottager's lamp or a fellow traveler's torch. The harder he chased it, the deeper into the wilds he'd stumble, until the ground grew soft underfoot and the light vanished, leaving him alone in the mire. This wasn't just folklore, it was a masterclass in how desperation warps perception. The real horror wasn't the light itself, it was the moment you realized you'd been following a lie. Modern horror thrives on this legacy. The bioluminescent fungi in Annihilation, shimmering with unnatural beauty as they disorient explorers, owe a debt to those medieval swamp lights. Video games like The Witcher 3 and Dark Souls fill their shadowed marshes with floating flames that promise treasure but deliver ambushes. Even Harry Potter's Hinkypunk's tiny creatures carrying lanterns to mislead travelers are direct descendants of the-wisp, proving that the fear of false guidance transcends eras. Yet there's a strange poetry to these myths. Scientific explanations, swamp gases igniting spontaneously, do nothing to dim their metaphorical power. The will-o'-the-wisp endures because it speaks to a timeless truth. The dangers we're most vulnerable to are the ones that mirror our desires. Fantasy literature understands this intimately. When a character in The Lord of the Rings follows elf lights into danger, or a protagonist in Piranesi chases phantom reflections, they're walking paths first lit by those medieval storytellers who knew the cruelest traps aren't sprung by jaws or claws, but by our own unanswered prayers. And perhaps that's why these eerie lights still haunt our stories. They're reminders that not every path in the dark is meant to be taken, that sometimes the wisest thing to do is stand still, even when every instinct screams to follow the glow. The will-o'-the-wisp wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a mirror held up to humanity's oldest dilemma: how to tell the difference between a lifeline and a lure when all you have is the light in your own trembling hands. The forest floor trembles ever so slightly, not from storms or quakes, but from the slow, steady breath of slumbering warriors beneath the roots. Across medieval Europe, whispers told of hollow hills where history's greatest knights slept, their armor gathering moss, their swords resting on chests that still rose and fell with the rhythm of centuries. The most famous of these dormant defenders, King Arthur himself, said to lie hidden in a cavern beneath Avalon's mist-shrouded oaks, his crown resting beside him until Britain's darkest hour would summon him back. But Arthur was never alone in his enchanted repose. From Germany's Kifhiusa mountain, where Emperor Frederick Barbarossa waited with his red beard grown through a stone table, to the Czech legends of Blanek's armored host, forests became secret barracks for heroes in suspended animation. What makes these myths so compelling is their tension between absence and presence. These knights weren't dead, they were in reserve, their existence a promise that the land itself remembered its protectors. The hollow hills functioned as living reliquaries where time moved differently. A peasant might stumble upon a cavern entrance and glimpse the sleeping company, only to blink and find it vanished, or worse, linger too long and emerge to find decades had passed in what felt like minutes. This wasn't just escapism, it was a coping mechanism for conquered peoples. When Welsh bards sang of Arthur's eventual return during English rule, or Sicilian rebels spoke of Frederick rising to drive out invaders, they were spinning hope into the very landscape. The forest, already a place of transformation, became a time capsule for national identity. Modern fantasy has weaponized this trope with glee. Tolkien's Dead Men of Dunharrow, spectral warriors bound to fulfill their oath in The Lord of the Rings, channel the Hollow Hills' eerie patience. The Witcher 3 Blood and Wine expansion introduces the Tesha Knights, vampiric crusaders entombed for centuries until blood wakes them. Even Game of Thrones plays with the idea through the Stark crypts, where stone kings with iron swords seem to whisper warnings to their descendants. But the real genius of these adaptations lies in how they tweak the myth's trigger. Medieval legends often tied the awakening to vague prophecies, when the raven drinks from the mountain's tears, or when the apple tree bears fruit in winter. Contemporary stories make the summons more intimate. In the Chronicles of Narnia, it's a child's horn blast that rouses the forest's hidden allies. In Hellboy, it's a demon's blood spilled on ancient soil. The message shifts from wait for destiny to destiny needs a nudge. Beneath all the variations, though, the core appeal remains unchanged. These sleeping knights embody our deepest longing, that righteousness isn't extinct, just hibernating. That when the night grows dark enough, the earth itself might cough up reinforcements. The next time you walk past a strangely symmetrical hill or a cave mouth choked with vines, consider what might lie beneath. History has a way of leaving its weapons where we least expect them, oiled and sharpened, just in case the world forgets its promises, and the forest. It's always been the best keeper of secrets and the most patient alarm clock. The deeper you wandered into the medieval woods, the more likely you were to stumble upon water that didn't just quench thirst, it rewrote fate. Enchanted springs bubbled up in countless legends, their surfaces shimmering like liquid mercury under the canopy's dappled light. Some whispered healing into broken bones or sight into blind eyes. Others carried curses so potent a single sip could turn a knight into a stag, or trap a maiden in ageless sleep until love's kiss broke the spell. These weren't just ponds, they were thresholds where the ordinary rules of nature dissolved. The Celts called them thin places, where the barrier between worlds wore as translucent as morning mist over water. Take the myth of the Fountain of Youth, which seeped into European folklore from distant lands. Medieval maps marked its supposed location with elaborate illustrations, a spring guarded by serpents or dryads, promising vigor to those brave enough to seek it. But the stories never ended with simple rejuvenation. Often, the water's gift came with a cruel twist. Restored youth might erase memories, or the seeker could find themselves stranded outside time altogether. The spring in the Breton tale of the Knight of the Fountain didn't just heal wounds. It showed visions of future sorrows, leaving drinkers burdened with knowledge they couldn't unsee. These myths understood something profound. Transformation always costs more than we expect. Fantasy worlds have inherited this duality. The mirror of Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings isn't a spring, but it functions like a liquid surface that reveals truth at the risk of obsession. The Witcher's Broccolan Forest hides waters that bond outsiders to the Dryads, rewriting their very loyalty. Even Harry Potter's Pensive, where memories swirl like liquid silver, echoes the Enchanted Spring's role as a keeper of hidden truths. What makes these modern versions so compelling is how they preserve the medieval spring's essence. Water doesn't just reflect, it changes. But the most haunting springs weren't those of healing or prophecy. They were the silent ones, the pools where you saw not the future, but yourself stripped bare. Norse myths spoke of Mimir's Well, where Odin sacrificed an eye for wisdom, the water showing him the cosmos' tangled threads. In Welsh lore, the Lady of the Lake's realm wasn't just a sword vault. It was a liquid mirror that reflected a knight's worthiness or lack thereof. These stories recognized water as the ultimate truth teller. You couldn't lie to it, couldn't hide your flaws from its surface. No wonder so many myths featured heroes terrified of their own reflections. The spring didn't just show who they were. It showed who they might become, and that's why these enchanted waters still ripple through our stories. They're reminders that every choice is a stone cast into a pool, the consequences spreading farther than we can predict. The next time you see a still forest pond in a game or book, hesitate before you drink. The clearest waters run deepest, and not all transformations can be undone. The rustle of silk-thick webs brushing against your face, the skitter of too many legs just beyond sight. A few creatures tap into primal dread like giant spiders lurking in the forest's depths. Tolkien's Mirkwood may have immortalized them, but these eight-legged horrors crawled through European folklore centuries before Bilbo ever stumbled into their lair. Medieval tales spoke of forests where the trees themselves seemed to conspire with these predators, their branches sagging under webs as strong as ship's rope, their shadows hiding bodies wrapped like grisly gifts. These weren't just oversized insects, they were manifestations of the wild's indifference, nature's answer to human arrogance. Step off the path, the stories warned, and you'd learn just how small you really were. What made these myths so visceral was their grounding in real fears. In an era where wolf attacks or venomous bites could mean death, the idea of spiders growing large enough to hunt people felt like a nightmare made flesh. The Brocken Spectre, a German legend of a mountain-dwelling spider that mimicked human voices to lure victims, played on the terror of deception, the forest not just as a hunter but a trickster. Slavic folklore took it further with the Joragumo-like entities, spiders that spun illusions of beautiful women to ensnare travelers. These stories didn't just scare, they taught caution. The forest's beauty was a veneer, they implied, and beneath it lay instincts older than civilization. Fantasy writers have seized this legacy with gusto. Mirkwood spiders are Tolkien's homage to those old tales, but their influence scuttles much farther. The sculptures of the Legend of Zelda, with their human-faced abdomens, channel the medieval blend of familiarity and horror. Harry Potter's Aragog isn't just a beast, he's a patriarch, ruling a colony that mirrors the forest's unforgiving hierarchy. Even Game of Thrones nods to the trope with its giant ice spiders, creatures so ancient they feel dredged from the collective unconscious. What unites these modern versions is their refusal to reduce spiders to mindless monsters. Like their folkloric ancestors, they're symbols of greed, of entrapment, of the delicate threads that bind life and death. Yet there's a deeper layer to these myths, one often overlooked. Spiders weren't just villains, they were weavers of fate. Norse legends link them to the Norns who spun destiny's webs. Celtic lore saw webs as maps of interconnectedness, each strand a life touching others. The forest spiders then embodied duality, destroyers and creators, chaos and order. That's why they still haunt our stories. When the Witcher's Geralt cuts through a cocooned village or Hollow Knight's protagonist navigates the Weaver's den, they're wrestling with the same paradox medieval storytellers understood. The things that terrify us are often the things that hold the world together. So the next time you see a cobweb glinting in fantasy game fog or read about silk-strung corpses in a novel, remember, those threads stretch back further than you'd think. The spiders were here first, and they've been spinning their lessons into the dark corners of our imagination for longer than we've dared to whisper their names. Branches creak like bending bones, roots shift like restless sleepers. This was no mere woodland to those who listened closely. In certain medieval myths, the forest wasn't just alive with creatures. It was the creature, a vast, breathing entity with intentions as deep as its roots. To the Celts, harming a sacred oak wasn't vandalism. It was assault, inviting curses that could wither crops or sour milk. Slavic farmers left offerings of bread at the edges of groves, whispering prayers to the Leshy as one might negotiate with a temperamental landlord. These weren't superstitions, they were survival strategies rooted in the understanding that nature wasn't a backdrop, it was a participant, watching, judging, and occasionally intervening. This concept of the sentient forest thrived on reciprocity. A lost traveler who spared a sapling might find the trees subtly parting to reveal a path home. But those who hacked at trunks without ceremony, they'd stumble in circles until their axes dulled, the very air thickening with disapproval. The Welsh tale of the Cephal dw circumflexar, a spectral horse luring loggers to drown, wasn't just a ghost story, it was an ecological warning label. The forest's wrath wasn't arbitrary, it was cause and effect dressed in mythic garb. Modern science confirms what these stories intuited. Trees communicate through fungal networks, share nutrients with stricken neighbors, even recognize kin. The medieval world just personified that intelligence, giving it a face and a voice. Fantasy literature has embraced this ethos wholeheartedly. The Lord of the Rings' Fangorn Forest isn't just home to Ents. The trees themselves seethe with quiet fury at Saruman's axes. Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke takes it further, casting the forest as a literal deity, its wolf children and tree spirits defending their mother with tooth and claw. Even video games like Horizon Zero Dawn depict biomass as computational networks, their machines behaving like antibodies against human exploitation. These aren't just creative choices, they're continuations of a dialogue medieval myths began. one where nature isn't a resource but a sovereign, yet the most compelling iterations explore nuance. The sentient forest isn't always righteous. In The Witcher, the Brokilon's dryads are protectors but also kidnappers, forcibly recruiting girls to replenish their ranks. Annihilation's shimmering wilderness transforms DNA with no regard for morality, beautiful and horrific in equal measure. These stories honor the old myth's complexity. The forest isn't good or evil. It's other, operating by rules we strain to comprehend. What makes this myth endure isn't just its ecological resonance, it's the emotional truth beneath the bark. When we see a character in Avatar bond with the Tree of Souls or watch the Green Knight's foliage coil with deliberate menace, we're tapping into something primal. The medieval world knew what we've tried to forget, that the wild places aren't empty, they're listening, and whether they help or hinder might just depend on how we ask. Some forests didn't just conceal spirits or monsters, they hid entire civilizations, shimmering just beyond mortal sight. Medieval legends spoke of cities woven from spider silk and starlight, their spires rising between ancient oaks, visible only to those who stumbled upon them at the exact right moment, or to those the Fae deemed worthy. Avalon, that mist-veiled isle of apple trees and eternal twilight, wasn't just a refuge for King Arthur. It was a gateway to a world where time flowed differently, where a single night might last a century in the land of men. The Celtic term Nain Og, the land of youth, promised more than immortality. It offered a realm untouched by decay, where music hung in the air like perfume and every feast lasted forever. These weren't just destinations, they were temptations, testaments to humanity's oldest longing, to find a place where suffering couldn't follow. What made these hidden realms so haunting was their elusiveness. A shepherd might chase a rare butterfly into a glade and emerge into streets paved with iridescent cobblestones, only to return home with a pocketful of fairy gold that crumbled to leaves at dawn. Breton tales warned of cities that appeared drowning in golden light at dusk, their bells ringing with unearthly melodies, but to step inside without invitation was to risk becoming a permanent resident, your mortal life erased like footsteps in the tide. The forest, already a threshold between worlds, became a curtain shielding entire societies operating on alien logic. Their existence whispered a dangerous question. What if the wild places weren't empty? What if they were crowded with eyes watching from just beyond perception? Modern urban fantasy has taken this myth and spliced it with steel and neon. Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere grafts London below onto the city's sewers and forgotten alleys, a fey metropolis humming beneath commuters' feet. The Mortal Instruments series hides warlock enclaves behind glamoured brownstones, while Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell reimagines fairy roads as shadowy parallels to Regency England's cobbled streets. These stories preserve the old myth's core, the thrill of discovery, the peril of overstaying your welcome, but twist the stakes. No longer are these realms just refuges for the weary, they're battlegrounds where ancient magic clashes with modern ambition. Yet the most fascinating adaptations explore the cost of crossing over. In Pan's Labyrinth, Ophelia's underground kingdom is beautiful but demands horrifying trials. The Hazelwood turns fairyland into a gilded prison, its stories rewriting intruders into tragic archetypes. Even Stardust Stormhold, for all its whimsy, operates on ruthless fairy tale logic. Break a promise, lose your heart. These narratives honor the medieval understanding that Fey cities weren't utopias, they were deals struck with fine print. The eternal youth of Tyr Nain Og came with a price. Step back onto mortal soil, and the centuries you evaded would claim you in an instant. Beneath the glitter and grandeur, these myths harbor a warning as old as the first campfire tale. The hidden city isn't just a place, it's a choice. To enter is to gamble your past for a future unbound by human rules. Perhaps that's why they endure. In an age of satellites and streetlights, we still half expect to turn a corner and find a door that wasn't there yesterday, a gateway to a world where the clocks don't tick, they sing. And the forest, with its layered shadows and whispered history, remains the perfect hiding place for civilizations too proud, too strange, or too fragile to endure the glare of broad daylight. The snap of a twig, the whisper of an arrow loosed, then silence. No thud of a felled stag, no triumphant cry, just the forest holding its breath as the huntsman realizes his prey has vanished again. Across medieval Europe, whispers told of men cursed to chase shadows through endless trees, their punishment for some forgotten sin, arrogance toward the gods, cruelty to the weak, or worse. The cursed huntsman wasn't just a ghost story. He was a warning etched into the landscape, proof that the forest had its own scales of justice, and they balanced in ways more poetic than any courtroom. Take the German legend of Hans Trapp, the wealthy hunter who scoffed at beggars and shot game for sport rather than sustenance. His sentence, to roam the Black Forest forever, his once fine clothes rotting into tatters, his hounds turned spectral, their howls echoing as they pursued a white stag that dissolved like mist each time his fingers brushed its flank. The tale wasn't just about punishment, it was about futility. The forest, in its infinite patience, had turned the huntsman's own obsession against him, trapping him in the moment he loved most and twisting it into hell. Gothic literature seized this motif with relish. Washington Irving's The Spectre Bridegroom features a huntsman doomed to ride the night, his horse's hooves forever pounding toward a wedding he'll never attend. Even Sleepy Hollow's Headless Horseman carries traces of the archetype, his pumpkin-headed quarry always one gallop ahead. But modern fantasy digs deeper, exploring the psychological torment beneath the curse. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt isn't just a cavalcade of wraiths, it's a reflection of Geralt's own relentless pursuit of purpose, a reminder that some chases hollow you out long before they end. What makes these myths so chilling is their intimacy. The huntsman's curse isn't fire and brimstone, it's the agony of repetition, of realizing too late that the thing you desired most has become your prison. The forest, impartial as a judge, doesn't strike him down. It lets him wear himself down, one endless sprint at a time, and perhaps that's why the trope endures. In a world of instant gratification, the idea of an eternal pursuit strikes a nerve. The next time you see a character in a story chasing something just out of reach, a ghost, a lover, redemption, listen for the rustle of leaves in the background. The oldest trees remember all the others who ran that path before them, and how few ever stopped running. Deep in the thickets where sunlight struggled to penetrate, medieval travelers whispered of patches of earth too orderly to be wild circles of foxglove and monkshood, mandrake roots shaped like screaming men, belladonna berries glistening like drops of midnight. These were the witches' gardens, hidden laboratories where the lines between medicine and magic blurred into something far more potent. Unlike the cultivated herb beds of monasteries, these gardens thrived in the forest's shadow, their plants pulsing with a reputation as dual-edged as the daggers witches supposedly used to harvest them. One leaf could ease a fever, its neighbor, brewed wrong, might stop a heart mid-beat. The forest, already a place of mystery, became an apothecary of the uncanny, where every petal held a promise and a threat. What made these gardens so terrifying and fascinating was their defiance of categories. To a starving village, a witch's knowledge of which mushrooms could fill bellies without bringing death was a lifeline. Yet that same wisdom, wielded in secret, could be framed as heresy. The mandrake, with its human-like root, was said to shriek when uprooted, a sound that could kill the hearer unless the plant was harvested under a full moon with a dog's help. Such rituals weren't just superstition, they were theater, reinforcing the idea that nature's gifts demanded respect. The garden wasn't just a plot of dirt, it was a covenant, a reminder that healing and harm grew from the same soil. Fantasy worlds have rooted themselves in this legacy. The potion ingredients of Harry Potter, from fluxweed to boomslang skin, echo the witch's garden's mix of the mundane and the macabre. The witch's Geralt doesn't just swing a sword, he brews decoctions from forest-gathered herbs, their effects as unpredictable as their medieval counterparts. Even Skyrim's alchemy system, where players combine mountain flowers and deathbell blossoms, mirrors the trial and terror of ancient herbcraft. But modern interpretations often miss the garden's deeper symbolism. They weren't just fantasy convenience stores. They were metaphors for knowledge itself, dangerous, transformative, and always at risk of being trampled by those who feared what they couldn't control. Yet the most intriguing aspect of these myths isn't their darkness, it's their resilience. Many witchly herbs had real medicinal value. Belladonna dilated pupils and was used in early eye surgery, while willow bark, a common painkiller, birthed aspirin. The garden's true magic lay in their straddling of worlds, science and folklore, reverence and fear. When a modern herbalist gathers yarrow or St. John's wort, they're walking the same knife's edge as those medieval women who braved the forest shadows. The plants haven't changed, only the stories around them have, and that's why these gardens still haunt our stories. They're reminders that the forest keeps its secrets close, not in locked chests or spellbooks, but in the quiet defiance of a flowering weed pushing up through the loam. The next time a fantasy character plucks a glowing herb or stirs a cauldron of dubious broth, listen for the whisper of older tales. The difference between poison and cure was never the plant. It was the hands that held it and the minds that feared what they couldn't bury. Among the most revered figures in medieval forest lore were the guardian beasts, majestic creatures standing sentinel over sacred groves, their very presence a bulwark against corruption. Picture a unicorn emerging from the mist at the heart of an ancient woodland, its horn gleaming like polished silver, its hooves leaving no mark on the moss. This wasn't just a pretty legend, it was a declaration of boundaries. Where the unicorn walked, poison withered, streams ran clear in its shadow, and those who entered with malice in their hearts would find only empty glades where the creature had been moments before. The unicorn wasn't merely a symbol of purity, it was the forest's own immune system, a living filter for human wickedness. Griffins, with their lions' bodies and eagles' wings, played a fiercer role. Perched atop craggy trees or soaring above the canopy, they were the aerial wardens of hidden treasures, not just gold, but the intangible riches of the wild. Slavic tales spoke of griffins nesting in the highest branches of the world tree, their talons gripping the boundary between earth and sky. To challenge them was to invite lightning-fast strikes, but to prove oneself worthy. That might earn passage to realms beyond ordinary sight. These creatures weren't arbitrary gatekeepers. They distilled the forest's essence into tangible form: mercy for the respectful, mercilessness for the exploitative. What's fascinating is how these myths persist in modern fantasy, often stripped of their moral weight but never their grandeur. The unicorns of Harry Potter retain their healing magic, but they are also elusive, vanishing from all but the purest seekers. The chronicles of Narnia's griffins are noble warriors, their loyalty to Aslan mirroring medieval beliefs in their divine alignment. Even the witches' leshens, though darker, echo the guardian archetype, their antlered silhouettes looming as protectors of forgotten groves. But the deepest legacy lies in what these beasts represent. The idea that nature doesn't need walls or laws to defend itself. It has teeth, wings, and horns, and the wisdom to wield them. Yet guardian beasts were never just blunt instruments. Their legends often hinged on tests of character. a unicorn might appear to a lost child but flee from a knight in blood-stained armor. A griffin could spare a starving woodcutter gathering fallen branches but eviscerate a lord felling oaks for a banquet hall. Their judgments felt primal, instinctive, as if the forest itself had learned to manifest its approval or disdain. That's why these creatures still resonate. They're not just relics of a simpler time, they're mirrors. In a world where deforestation and climate crisis dominate headlines, the unicorn's refusal to tolerate corruption feels less like fantasy and more like a warning we failed to heed. So the next time you encounter a mythical guardian in a game or novel, look past the glittering horn or the gilded feathers. These beasts were never just decoration. They were, and still are, the embodied conscience of the wild, a reminder that the land has always known how to protect itself. The only question is whether we'll ever learn to listen before the guardians decide we're the threat they were meant to repel. One moment, the path lies clear beneath your feet; the next, it dissolves into underbrush as if it never existed. Across medieval Europe, stories whispered of these vanishing trails, where the forest itself seemed to judge who deserved passage. Unlike ordinary dead ends, these weren't accidents of terrain. They were deliberate trials woven with the same cunning as a spider's web. In Breton folklore, only those who left offerings for the forest spirits, a lock of hair, a sip of wine, found their way to hidden glades where healing herbs grew. Germanic legends spoke of Wegsilut, invisible path-keepers who rerouted travelers based on some unknowable metric. Kindness shown to a beggar, perhaps, or arrogance toward a gnarled old tree. The message was clear: the forest didn't just test survival skills, it measured hearts. What makes these myths so enduring is their psychological depth. The vanishing path wasn't a barrier, it was a mirror. A knight might charge forward, hacking at branches, only to find himself back where he started. A woodcutter's daughter, humming and scattering crumbs for birds, might watch the trees part before her like a curtain. These stories recognized intuition as a currency older than coinage, teaching that sometimes the straightest route required walking in circles until the lesson sank in. The forest, in its infinite patience, had no use for haste, only readiness. Modern fantasy has refined this motif into an art form. The shifting staircases of Harry Potter's Hogwarts aren't just whimsy. They're descendants of those medieval vanishing paths, rewarding adaptability over brute force. Video games like The Legend of Zelda and Elden Ring use labyrinthine forests that reconfigure themselves, punishing linear thinking. Even Pan's Labyrinth twists the trope, its fairy tale corridors testing Ophelia's moral compass rather than her sense of direction. The common thread: the path doesn't vanish randomly, it responds. Yet the most profound iterations explore the cost of refusal. In Welsh myth, those who ignored the forest's subtle cues, a fox's warning bark, a sudden chill in the air, often stumbled into domains where time fractured. Days became years in the blink of an eye, leaving them stranded in futures they no longer recognized. The vanishing path wasn't just a test, it was a mercy. Turn back now, it whispered, or lose yourself forever. And that's why these stories still resonate. In an age of GPS and asphalt, the idea of a trail that chooses its travelers feels radical. The next time you encounter a magical doorway in a story or a maze that defies logic, listen for the rustle of ancient leaves beneath the pixels or prose. The oldest forests never gave directions, they gave revelations. And the right path, it was never the one you forced, it was the one that appeared when you finally stopped insisting you knew the way. From the spectral wild hunt to the whispering trees of Slavic lore, these 25 myths reveal how medieval Europe's enchanted forests shaped the fantasy worlds we love today. They remind us that forests are more than scenery, they are characters, challenges, and catalysts in storytelling. Whether through Tolkien's Middle-earth or Grimm's fairy tales, these legends endure because they speak to our deepest fears and wonders. If you've ever felt the call of a hidden path or the thrill of a moonlit glade, you've touched this legacy. What makes these myths so timeless isn't just their magic, it's their honesty. The medieval world didn't romanticize the wilderness, it respected its duality. A forest could be shelter or trap, healer or executioner, depending on the choices you made beneath its boughs. That's why these stories still resonate. When we step into the haunted woods of The Witcher or lose ourselves in the tangled politics of Game of Thrones' Wolfswood, we're not just escaping reality, we're engaging with a tradition that understood nature as an active force, not a passive backdrop. The trees remember, the shadows judge, and the paths, they only appear for those willing to learn their language. This legacy lives on because it answers questions we're still asking. How do we navigate a world that doesn't revolve around us? What debts do we owe to places older than memory? The medieval forest mythos offers no easy answers, but it gives us a framework, humility, reciprocity, and the courage to face what lurks in the thicket. So the next time you encounter a sentient tree in a video game or a cryptic fairy glade in a novel, pause for a moment. That's not just world building, it's a whisper from the past, a reminder that the oldest stories grow from roots we've been tracing for centuries. Now it's your turn. Which of these enchanted forest myths lingers in your imagination? Is it the phantom stag's haunting challenge, the green knight's emerald gaze, or the leshy's moss-covered tricks? Drop your favorite in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this journey through medieval Europe's shadowed groves, don't forget to subscribe. There are always more paths to explore, more whispers to decipher. The forest stories aren't done with us yet.